Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was adopted by Uchiha Mikoto. Uchiha Mikoto takes the hand of an outcast child, and with it rewrites the destiny of her clan. Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 1. It was nearing the end of Sasuke's first full day at the academy, and the sun of the fading summer shone down on Mikoto as she strolled leisurely back to the school to walk her son home. She didn't have to do this, she was the Lady Uchiha, and could have delegated the task to her maid, if she'd wished, and no one would have thought it was odd. But Mikoto always felt it was better she complete the mundane tasks of keeping house, in addition to her duties as the wife of the clan head. She was expected to be the elegant hostess, the oil that kept the cogs of clan politics running smoothly, conspicuous only in her absence. Doing the dishes, or picking her son up from school, didn't technically fall under this purview, but Mikoto did them anyway. She felt it kept her grounded. The thought that she was casting for excuses to be near Sasuke fluttered across her mind like a fallen leaf, and disappeared. It had been too quiet in the house today. She thought it would be a relief not to have the curious 6-year-old underfoot for a while, but, despite its benign cause, the silence in the large house was unsettling. Taking a long, uninterrupted bath, when was the last time she'd had one of those, turned out only to make it worse. After toweling off, she'd embarked on an epic cleaning mission to the cellars instead, to distract herself from the amorphous loneliness. It had worked, mostly, until she found a box of old photo albums in the back labeled Itachi, and had to stop. At first, she'd flipped through them idly, intermittently chuckling to herself at the memories they brought into sharper focus. Then she noticed that past the age of 8 he wasn't smiling in a single photograph. Her eldest son had been promoted to Jonin earlier this year, and ever since the simple ceremony he'd gone from cool to unreachably distant. He was the youngest in Konoha to ever attain that rank, save Hatake Kakashi, who'd beaten the Uchiha prodigy by all of 2 months. The whole clan was terribly proud of him, his father most of all, but his reaction to the praise had been to flinch from it as if they were words of rebuke. He did his duty, and did it well, but he never seemed to take the same pride in his accomplishments as his family and his peers. If Mikoto didn't know better, she would have thought he was ashamed of his skills. He had always been a reserved child, and, as an active duty Jonin, she'd expect him to conduct himself with more maturity than was usual for his 13 years on this earth, but this worried her deeply. When he was still a genin, he did have his unguarded moments, with her and especially with the toddling Sasuke, when a peaceful smile could be seen cracking through the hardening shinobi mask, and blossoming on his lips. After Itachi shut her out of his life, she'd turned to Sasuke, who was as loving a boy as a mother could wish for. He was proud to be an Uchiha, without too much of the arrogance that afflicted so many of their clan. Her husband's stern face flashed in her mind's eye, and his childlike determination to become chief of police, and beloved protector of Konoha, never failed to lift her heart. Sending him to the academy was the first step toward his dream. A tiny part of her, that she shushed without mercy, was afraid it might also be the first step towards making him another Itachi. A boy made a soldier when he was so small she could still balance him on one hip, a killer before his 9th birthday, a hardened assassin by his 13th. A child with barely a childhood. She shook those dark thoughts from her mind as her steps carried her to the scruffy gardens and training fields surrounding the academy. The youngest students, and a few of their parents, were milling around the playground, the older ones wandering home in uneven clumps. From the far side of the lot, she picked out the head of bluish, and perpetually unkempt, hair, and waved. She'd brushed it flat this morning, but, unlike the rest of him, Sasuke's hair could never seem to behave itself. "Hi, Mom." He warbled from his perch on the seesaw, where a skinny blonde boy was bouncing him up and down with gusto. She noted, with a sniff of superiority, that the Hyuga had sent some branch house member to pick up their precious, pearl-eyed princess from her first day of school. Hyuga-sama apparently couldn't be bothered. His late wife had been a sweet woman, if a bit on the timid side. It was a pity none of her loving nature had rubbed off on her husband. Among her son's other classmates, she recognized a few students from other prominent clans as well, an Aburame in a hooded sweatshirt despite the heat, an Inyazuka, With very sharp teeth and a fang motif imprinted below each eye, a self-assured Yamanaka, with hair so blonde it was almost white, and an Ara and an Akimichi snacking together in the grass, judging from the bottle brush black ponytail and very round tattooed cheeks, respectively. She greeted the assistant teacher supervising the playground on her way over, a rather nervous-looking young man with a scar across the bridge of his nose. He didn't look older than mid-teens himself, and Mikoto realized this was probably his first day of school too, albeit on the other side of the lectern. His brown eyes wandered over the pattern of red and white fans adorning the breast of her kimono, and he bowed very deeply. Sasuke-kun helped me demonstrate the first taijutsu forms today. I didn't expect him to be so far ahead of the rest of his class with those. Uchiha-sama, he said, opened his mouth, and then shut it again very quickly. I mean, of course he's very skilled, he added, and cleared his throat anxiously. I just didn't know how skilled. Just like Itachi-san, I've been told. Amazing, really. Mikoto politely stifled a chuckle at his obvious discomfort. Since his father was so often working late at the police headquarters, and his brother gone on missions, she'd done a lot of Sasuke's preliminary training herself. He was very good for his age, but not that good. She was guilty of spoiling him a bit, and never pushed him as hard as her husband had pushed a younger Itachi. For a shinobi, the teacher wasn't very adept at hiding his body language, and what it was saying was quite clearly, oh crap, I just told the clan head's wife I didn't expect much out of their kid. I just got this job, please don't get me fired. On one level, he did have a reason to be worried. The Uchiha were notoriously easy to insult, and they tended to hold grudges, too. It was a characteristic of her clan Mikoto didn't much share, and she smiled encouragingly at the young teacher. I'm glad to hear he's doing so well. But don't be afraid to nudge him toward more practice if you think he needs it, especially in endurance training. A shinobi can only get so far on pure talent. I'll keep that in mind, he replied, absently smoothing down his hair in relief. He obviously hadn't expected her to accept his authority as an instructor gracefully, and so Mikoto made a conscious point of doing so. The prissy behavior of some of her friends in the clan towards their children's teachers was frankly embarrassing. A lot of being a good shinobi was plain hard work, no matter what kind of incredible kekai genkai one had been graced with, and shortcuts and favoritism in their student days were like as not to see her friends' sons injured or killed once they faced their first real challenges in the field. Good luck with your new class, she said to him, moving again toward Sasuke. He thanked her quickly before turning to greet the next parent. Her son was still laughing and seesawing away, although he wasn't doing much of the work. The other boy was a fountain of energy, and was still pushing off full strength with nary a hitch in his breath. Did you make a new friend today? She asked, strolling over to them. His name is, he began, as the blonde boy finally paused in his bouncing, and grinned at her. Mikoto felt the sun-kissed air and sound of children's voices fall away, replaced with cold autumn rain and the screams of the injured and the dying. She didn't hear Sasuke speak his name. She already knew. The Kyuubi. The demon fox. No one knew how deep its influence on its prison went, but the whisker marks imprinted on the flesh of his cheeks were frighteningly telling. She grabbed Sasuke roughly by the arm, and pulled him from his seat, tipping the other side of the seesaw against the ground with a thunk and a pained grunt from his partner. Let's go, Sasuke, she said shortly, turning away from the abomination. Her son resisted, pulling her back in the direction of the other boy. She refused to meet his eyes again, afraid of the unearthly malice she might find there, if her gaze lingered. She had lost so much to that beast. Its arrival pulled her away from a retirement she'd finally made her peace with, away from a months-old baby. Nursing mothers, the old, the crippled, the children, everyone who could walk and owned a Hittite was thrust into service in the aftermath of that terrible day. Since so many of the Uchiha were stationed permanently in Konoha as members of the military police, their losses were staggering, the greatest in proportion to their numbers of all the major ninja clans. Mikoto herself had survived largely unscathed, but the same was not true of her family. Her mother and maternal grandparents were killed when one of the emergency shelters was reduced to rubble by an errant thrash of its tails. Her two older brothers, fraternal twins, were among the first to engage the demon, and paid dearly for that selfless courage. Koichi was crushed into an unrecognizable smear of blood and viscera, and Kojiro suffered extensive chakra burns across his face and chest that resisted every medic's attempt to heal them. He survived the battle, but completely blinded and in horrific pain. The day he was lucid enough to understand what had happened to his twin, Mikoto came in to change his bandages, and found him face down on the blood-soaked mattress with his naked tanto in his hand. Whyy. Sasuke whined, wriggling against her fingers, and breaking the grip of the horrible memory. Mikoto snapped back to the sunny day and the pleasant bubbling of children's laughter with a sharp intake of breath. You told me this morning I should make lots of friends. Why can't Naruto be my friend? He's funny, and he didn't start crying like a baby when I hit him in taijutsu class. Not like that stupid girl with pink hair. I told you, we're leaving. Itachi is coming home from his mission tonight, and I need to start dinner. Sasuke screwed up his face, and frowned at her. He's not going to eat it anyway. He always grabs something with his team if he gets home late, and he always gets home late. Can't we stay for a little bit more? Mikoto sighed in exasperation. The perceptiveness of shinobi children wasn't always a blessing. Against her better judgment, she looked back to the fox brat. His grin had faded into an expression of vexation, and he was lamely pushing himself up and down on the seesaw, as if he couldn't care less he was now playing alone. He made no move to follow Sasuke, like he'd experienced this strange reaction many times before, and knew better than to try his luck. Now that she looked at him a second time, she noticed how thin he really was. Not growth spurt thin, either. Underfed thin. His cheeks weren't nearly as round as they could have been, and the stained t-shirt hung far too loosely from his bony shoulders. Konoha was prosperous. No child should be going without good meals, especially the son of a Kage, whether or not his parentage was common knowledge. There was something desperately wrong here. A shinobi's thirst for vengeance, and a mother's compassion for a hungry child, intermingled in Mikoto's heart. He tried, hesitantly, smiling at her again. Aside from the scrawniness and the whisker marks, it was like looking at a portrait of the Yondaime. But that smile didn't make her think of his father. It made her think of his mother, and some of the last words they had spoken to each other. He'll be the same age as Sasuke, so I hope they'll be friends. She released her hold on her son, and her hand dropped slowly back to her thigh. Sasuke giggled in triumph, and trotted back to Naruto's side. She let her eyes drift out of focus, and back into memory, while the boys resumed their games. Who did she think she was, to deny the last wish of one of her dearest friends? She hated the Kyuubi like she hated no other living thing, but Naruto was something else besides the Kyuubi. He was the only son of Uzumaki Kushina. 6 years ago, she had felt the demon's killing intent sweep over her, a primal terror so intense it had taken every scrap of her willpower not to jam her own kunai into her throat, just to make the feeling stop. If she let go her assumptions, and looked with an analytical eye, she could see none of that malevolence emanating from the boy in front of her. She was familiar with the theory behind Fuinjutsu, if not the practice, and knew objectively that it was possible to seal a biju within a human being while retaining the vessel's humanity. Although she hadn't known the secret until after her untimely death, Kushina herself was proof of that. No one had confirmed nor denied anything, not to Mikoto, but she laid the pieces out, and assembled them into a perfect picture. She had been a very good student of history. She knew the Shodai Hokage possessed the ability to control the tailed beasts. She knew Uchiha Madara, the traitorous, fallen lord of the Uchiha, had used the Kyuubi against him in their final confrontation at the Valley of the End. She knew that the Shodai's wife, Uzumaki Mito, Uzumaki, had joined the battle to aid her dying husband, finally tipping it in the Senju's favor with her mastery of seals. Suddenly there was no more Kyuubi, the Shodai was taken back to Konoha and healed, and everyone except Madara lived happily ever after. Mito outlived her husband by a ridiculous interval, finally passing in her sleep at over 120 years old, the same year Kushina had come to live in Konoha. Her textbooks never specified what happened to it, but considering how reluctant Iwa had been to attack Konoha itself during the Third Great War, she was willing to bet it was fear of the Kyuubi that kept them from storming the walls. Looking back, it was hard to imagine the relentlessly cheerful, impulsive, free-spirited Kushina inspiring that kind of fear. She was everything the younger Mikoto hadn't been, raised in the stifling confines of expectation and tradition, and Mikoto loved her for it. She was the bad influence who taught the clan heir's fiancé how to swear like a mercenary captain, to stumble home giggling drunk, to look the old clan head right in the eye, and refuse when he demanded she retire and marry before she made jonin. She was what kept Mikoto sane during the first rocky years of her marriage to Fugaku, before they'd made their compromises and uneasy truce. There was no way around it. She owed Kushina. "You're right, Sasuke," she said, forcing uneasiness into her tone she didn't feel. "I don't know where my brain is today. Come to think of it, your father said he'd be working overtime today too. We can eat late. Do you want to get a snack in the meantime?" "Yeah," he said, with enthusiasm. "How about the onigiri place? It's on the way home." "Sort of, ish. I don't know, that's pretty far out of the way," she said, slipping into mother mode before she could stop herself. "Please? It's my first day really learning how to be a shinobi. Iruka-sensei said I was really good at helping him with demonstrations." Good point," she conceded. Little sneak. He knew perfectly well how much difficulty his mother had saying no to their Akira-filled ones. Naruto had turned away from their conversation, and resumed his lonely swinging up and down. He was chewing on his lip, and trying not to look desperately hungry. She walked over to him, and smiled in what she hoped was a loving manner. "Naruto-chan," she said, reluctantly appending the affectionate suffix, "do you like an egg?" His face lit up like a festival bonfire at the first spark of her attention, and he scrambled to his feet. "Yeah, I love onigiri. Not as much as I love ramen, but I don't really love anything as much as I love ramen, and anyways I will definitely come eat onigiri with you and Sasuke whenever you want. What's your name? Where are we going? Do you live in the really nice house on the edge of town? Sasuke says you do, but your family must be really big to fill up that big house." "My house isn't very big at all, so I thought." She held up a hand to dam the rush of words, which had absolutely no effect. "Naruto," she said, and then repeated herself, louder. He finally shut his mouth with a little pop. "My name is Uchiha Mikoto and you can call me Mikoto Obazan. We're going to a restaurant that Sasuke and I like very much. Our house is pretty big, and I do my best to make sure it looks nice." She began, as her brain finished processing the rush of questions. "Your house? You don't live by yourself, do you?" "Yeah, sort of I do," he replied. "Stuff kept happening to me at the orphanage that I didn't like at all, and the ladies there kept making out that it was my fault, which was stupid, because why would I do things like set my own shirt on fire while I was wearing it? And so finally the old man let me move into my own apartment. The landlady cooks for me, and does my laundry and stuff, but I think she needs to see a doctor for her head because she forgets an awful lot. I heard that happens when you get old, but she isn't that wrinkly yet. I hope she's not sick." Mikoto let his rambling wash over her, growing more and more horrified with every innocent word. Her conflict over his containing the thing that slaughtered her family faded away before the fact that someone deliberately attempted to set a little boy on fire. It had to get bad enough that an attempt to maim him, maybe even kill him, was what it took to get Naruto out of the public orphanage? Aside from mild malnourishment, she didn't see any physical signs of injury, but that didn't mean it wasn't happening. Kushina's bruises from their sparring sessions had faded in hours, and even a broken leg hadn't kept her from running laps for more than a couple of weeks. At the time she claimed it was an ability of the Uzumaki clan, but Mikoto now suspected it had more to do with her secret house guest than her parentage. Even in the grip of her own smoldering hatred of the Kyuubi, she didn't think she could bring herself to physically harm its young jailer. Especially since he turned out to be so ingenuously adorable. She'd only known Naruto for a few minutes, and, her history with his prisoner aside, had cautiously decided she liked him. She swallowed back the bitter anger at his nameless assailant, and her own feeling of negligence in the matter, and took one small, dirty hand in hers. She would make this up to Kushina. She would. Mikoto went to bed that night feeling more than a little queasy with guilt. When she and the boys walked into the small restaurant, the proprietor hadn't been able to fully mask his sneer at the sight of Naruto clinging to her hand. The service she and Sasuke received was as pleasant as usual, but somehow the waiter tripped and almost poured scalding hot tea all over the back of Naruto's head. Only Mikoto's shinobi reflexes had kept the tray level, and saved him from a very nasty burn. Later, when Sasuke asked to try a bite of one of Naruto's onigiri, he discovered the ones the other boy received were packed with dry, burned-tasting rice on the inside, compared to the moist ones on his own plate. The service for the table as a whole only improved when Mikoto murmured to Sasuke, well within their waiter's earshot, that the standards here had really slipped, and she'd be telling everyone she knew to avoid the place. Naruto didn't seem surprised by any of it, which was depressing. Did he receive this treatment from everyone? No wonder he seemed so uncomfortable sitting at their table. His manners were not poor so much as non-existent, but she could tell he was trying his very best to sit still and behave in the best way he knew how. He spent the whole of the small meal watching Sasuke like he had a Sharingan of his own, aping his every gesture as if he could absorb years of etiquette training in half an hour. Naruto turned out to be an extremely energetic child, but he heeded her gentle corrections to speak more quietly, and stop kicking the table, with gratifying determination. At 6 he already had a reputation as an audacious prankster and hellion in the making, but he wasn't a bad kid. In terms of his intentions, if not his impulsive actions, she would even go so far as to rate him better than most. He seemed to genuinely care what other people thought about him, and was desperately eager to please if given the chance. What struck her most was his concern for the well-being of people who clearly had none for his. In particular, the garbled story of the borderline abusive caretaker that lived down the hall made her furious on his behalf. Apparently, she would forget to bring him the home-cooked meals the Hokage was paying her to prepare, and Naruto would have to dig into his meager pocket money for convenience store ramen cups to fill his empty belly. Mikoto decided to start preparing an extra bento every school day, and stowing it nonchalantly in Sasuke's book bag for the foreseeable future. She turned restlessly in the large bed, and wished desperately for someone to talk to. Fugaku was working a difficult case this week, and would probably end up catching whatever sleep he could on the futon he kept in his office closet. She scowled up at the ceiling. Having another warm body in the bed was comforting in a small way, but it wasn't like she could talk to him about something like this anyway. Her Uchiha friends wouldn't do either. To a woman, all of them considered her friendship with Kushina a topic to be avoided like the discussion of an embarrassing rash. Their Jonin instructor had held an unassuming affection for both of them, and would have been ideal, but Hatake Asekumo had been dead by his own hand for a decade. Uchiha's hero, the last of her old genin trio, was still among the living to the best of her knowledge, but he was leading a long-term mission in the Land of Lightning, and was so unreachable he could be living on the moon. Save herself as of 7 hours ago, the Hokage was the only other person she was aware of that took an active, if limited, interest in Naruto's continued well-being. But he was so busy, it would be weeks before it was brought to his attention, and even if it was, there was no guarantee he could change things. Konoha was the most democratic of the ninja villages, and that meant the Hokage had no right to give the civilians direct orders unless their actions were directly threatening the village's integrity. She didn't think the mistreatment of one small boy was going to make the cut. Mikoto was a naturally companionable person, and had cultivated a long list of friends. It was a sucker punch to discover all the ones she could really count on were either dead, or so far away they might as well be. All the loneliness she'd been trying to push away since she awoke that morning came crashing down like the waters of a breaking dam. Mikoto's eyes began to burn with tears. She ground her fists into the sheets, and tried to force them down. "Why didn't you check on him?" Her conscience screamed at her in Kushina's most outraged voice. "You didn't even go to see him once. You left that up to Deus Hero when he'd just been accepted into Umbu, and didn't have time to babysit, and we both know Kakashi was too much of a fucking wreck after the Kyuubi killed Minato and Rin. You called yourself a shinobi when you were scared of a baby? You're nothing but a pretty little coward." "I had my own responsibilities," she whispered to the empty air. "I had a newborn of my own." The southern clan compound was almost leveled, and half the Uchiha were homeless. There was so little time. "Right," the inner voice scoffed. "You always were the responsible one, picking up the slack for me all the damn time, even when I didn't want you to. I'm sorry I was so busy being dead I couldn't pull my own weight the one time I really needed your help." Mikoto hadn't cried for years, since the night of the memorial before that mountain of a grave. But tonight she turned her face into her pillow, and lost her battle against the straining tears. "I'll do better, Kushina," she whispered between stifled sobs. "From now on, I'll do better." Chapter 2. The next morning Mikoto was back to her usual placid self, although Itachi kept drifting odd looks in her direction over breakfast. They weren't compassionate looks. Just odd, like he'd been completely aware of the noise, but didn't care enough to ask why his mother had been sobbing alone in her bedroom. He'd been like that practically his whole life, never cruel, just cold. Mikoto told herself for the millionth time that it shouldn't bother her, that it was how Itachi was, and then for the millionth time failed to heed her own advice. She packed the boys off to their respective commitments, Sasuke to school and Itachi off to a short-term mission, and had the house to herself again. This time around, she knew better than to loaf around in it, and drive herself crazy. Now that her head had been cleared by a good night's rest, she realized that she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Her first and only genin team was completely intact: Uzuki Yojeo, Gekko Haruka, and Kamita Ishimaru. She had spent so long thinking of them as the goofy kids they briefly were, she didn't feel comfortable broaching a subject of this nature, but that wasn't being fair. All of them were adults now, sneaking into their mid-20s. Unlike a lot of Jonin instructors, she had kept up good relationships with all of them, even if she didn't have the chance to see them as often as she would have liked. Quite a few of her former peers were more Jonin than sensei, and taught only under duress, because there weren't enough warm bodies to distribute to the rookie teams. Those genin always seemed itchy to pass the chunin exams, for no other reason than to be rid of their crazy teachers. Mikoto had worked her team very hard, managing to manhandle all three to the final round of the exams on their second try, and had seen two of those pass on that exam and the third on the one 6 months later. She was pretty sure they all hated her guts for months after that second attempt, but, like good little ninja, in time they managed to see underneath the sadistic training sessions to the genuine love she had for them. She worked them so hard as genin so they'd be strong enough to survive, even thrive, as chunin and beyond. All of them had thanked her for that hellish month at one time or another, with identical wry smiles on their faces. Ishimaru was the most sensitive of the lot, and was also a bit older, since he'd stayed in school 2 extra years to be trained as a medic before being promoted to genin. He was also the child of civilian parents who had made their home on a farm kilometers out from Konoha, and consequently had lost the least to the Kyubi. Better yet, his apartment was plausibly close her to favorite clothing boutique, so she could drop by without feeling like a total fool. She changed out of her house dress into a loose tunic and calf-length pants, and gave her hair a cursory brushing before stepping out the door. Fugaku didn't like to see her wearing pants, preferring the feminine grace of an old-fashioned kimono, but the old grouch wasn't around to see, was he? It was another lovely summer day, and Mikoto took her time browsing through the open-air shops on her way to Ishimaru's building. The chief of police pulled in a tidy sum every year, so her face was a welcome one to the shopkeepers. She collected a few odds and ends she didn't realize she needed, and some new formal-heeled sandals, since her old ones were becoming too scuffed for shoe polish to salvage. So burdened, she let herself in through the unlocked back gate, and knocked briskly on Ishimaru's door. She could hear someone closing drawers in a hurry. Good. He was home. Ishimaru was not the one to answer the door. It was his lover Yamashiro Aba, and the chunin was missing both his trademark sunglasses and his air of affability. He had a backpack stuffed with clothes hanging from one hand, and for some reason was clutching what she assumed to be Ishimaru's toothbrush in the other. Mikoto-sensei, he said stupidly. Ishimaru's not here. They got bad intel. They weren't bandits, they were all shinobi, and, I'm going to visit him now if the medics will let me. The handle of Mikoto's shopping bag slipped through her fingers, and a small bottle of perfume smashed on the concrete landing. Normally, that news would not induce the kind of panic in a shinobi she saw written all over his face, but Ishimaru's rookie team was an unusual unit made up entirely of medics in training. Though they were taught to handle themselves in a fight, their primary purpose was search and rescue, or support of heavy combat teams. They were not sent alone on missions where fighting more intense than a few scuffles with civilians was expected. She was too polite to say it to him aloud, but someone at the mission office had seriously fucked up. She didn't blame him for expecting the worst. So did she. How badly was he hurt? She asked softly, while Abba juggled his things around, until he found his keys, and locked the place up. I don't know. I just learned he was dropped off at the hospital. Do you want to come with me? Absolutely. I'm going to take the roofs, it'll be faster with the lunch rush and everything, so I'll meet. Who said I'm not running the roofs too? She said, cutting him off. I can leave this stuff here. She prodded the shopping bag with her foot. If you don't mind unlocking the door again, and putting my purse into the other pocket of that backpack. He did as she asked, and pushed off from the sturdy railing of the stairwell. Mikoto followed, as soon as he'd cleared the roof space on the building across the alley. Lucky she'd decided on pants and flat sandals today. The first couple of landings were less than graceful, but soon the comfortable rhythm of chakra concentration and release in the muscles of her legs returned like she had never left it. They arrived on the roof deck of the hospital after about 15 minutes of rooftop travel. Mikoto found herself embarrassingly out of breath once they reached their destination, but he had other things to worry about, and didn't call her out on it. She secured visitors' passes to the burn ward for herself and Abba, who looked so sick with worry he was afraid to open his mouth in case he threw up on the poor receptionist. Ishimaru was in room 2245. She took a deep breath, preparing herself for something barely recognizable as human. A vision of her brother Kojiro welled up in her head, his handsome face mutilated beyond recognition by the Kyuubi's chakra, drugged nearly into insensibility but somehow still screaming. She forced it away, and pushed open the door. She let the breath out in an audible rush when Ishimaru blinked at his new visitors, and managed to smile hazily back at them. His round, genial face was toned to sickly gray beneath his tan, and his cinnamon hair still matted slightly with mud, but all in all he didn't look too bad. She did a quick tally of the limbs hidden by the hospital sheets, and came up with the same number he'd owned last time they'd spoken. The relief was so immense her knees momentarily went weak. Yojeo had beaten them there, and Ishimaru's ducklings were lined up in a neat row near the window, looking battered and grubby, but not seriously injured. The violet-haired Kunoichi nodded to Abba in greeting, and then to her. He slumped into an empty spot on the bed near Ishimaru's hips, and looked over the extensive bandages obscuring his right side. You scared the shit out of me, he said. What happened? Are you in a lot of pain? Katon, he wheezed, and immediately started coughing. Mikoto picked out the words rogue ninja, ambush, and gave me the good drugs between the painful spasms. The fit continued for some time, and eventually he gave up trying to speak. The tallest of his genin stood up to fill in the gaps, worrying at the torn cuff of his shirt and not meeting anyone's eyes. He was a Hyuga boy with light brown hair that fell in a long braid down his back, dressed in the traditional off-white robes favored by the clan. We were supposed to be rendering medical aid to a town caught in that earthquake near the Kusa border, he said. They'd had some problems with bandits on top of everything else, so once all our patients were stabilized Ishimaru-sensei decided to organize a preemptive strike to scare them off, before they tried to steal any of our medical supplies. Mikoto nodded. It had been a good idea, at least in theory. Medicines were often more attractive than plunder to someone living outside the law, since they were more immediately useful. A show of force by a small group of trained shinobi was often enough to rout the less stout-hearted troublemakers without bloodshed, and, when your team was composed entirely of medics, avoiding any unplanned confrontations was paramount. Except we didn't scare them off, the Hyuga continued. It turned out one of them was an old war deserter from Konoha, and knew he'd be recognized if Ishimaru-sensei got a good look at his face. There were some low-ranking Iwa ninja too, also deserters. They tricked my Byakugan by setting up a false camp that was hardly guarded, while the rest waited to ambush us out of my visual range. The boy frowned. That's how we knew we were really in trouble. Who else but another shinobi would know the maximum range of a genin's Byakugan right down to the meter? As soon as we reached the middle of the camp, he sighed, shamefaced, we got stuck in a Doton jutsu that turned the ground to muck so we couldn't leap clear. But Ishimaru-sensei saved us, one of his other students piped up, a girl with a rather prominent nose and the characteristic Inyazuka facial tattoos. 3 ash-gray puppies were curled up on the floor around her feet. He couldn't knock the guy's hand signs apart before he finished, so he jumped in front of him, and whipped out this awesome futon. Futon. Yojeo interrupted skeptically. Ishimaru had Suna blood in him from somewhere, and the wind styles were all the cards he had to play in terms of elemental ninjutsu. They were his only long-range jutsu, and worse than useless against a Katon user. Futon, the girl affirmed. He turned the fire back on the deserters, but he must have been tired from healing all those people, since his chakra ran out before the rogue ninjas did. That's how he got burned. The guy from Konoha got one of Sensei's kunai right in the eye, and lucky for us the misfire from the jutsu burned the Iwa shinobi pretty bad, too. She smiled lopsidedly at the Hyuga. Kaito-kun did some fast talking about probable survival rates without antibiotics, and they surrendered in exchange for us patching them up a bit. We handed them over to a Kusa team we met on their way back home. They were happy to get the bounty. Not the smartest thing you've ever done, Mikoto said, shaking her head as she addressed Ishimaru, but it worked. He shakily raised his uninjured arm, and gave her a thumbs up. Ishimaru was good at seeing the bright side in any situation. The narcotics probably helped. It could have been worse, the first genin said, looking guiltily down at his incapacitated and drug-addled teacher. Much worse, the third added, joining the conversation for the first time, from behind his high-collared coat. Must have been an aburame. He neglected to remove it even in the pleasant summer warmth. I already spoke with his physician, Yojeo put in. He's going to be on the injured list for a while, but the damage is mostly cosmetic, and his movement and breathing shouldn't be permanently impaired. Her stern gaze softened as it swept over his students. He also mentioned that you three did an excellent job of taking care of him on the way back to Konoha. If you'd let an infection take hold so far from real medical facilities, he probably would have died. Mikoto shifted her weight against the wall, and smiled to herself. She felt less like a mother, and more like a team captain, than she had in a long time, and in the best of all possible ways. She was proud as hell of Ishimaru, who in his genin days had been far and away the most timid of the team. It seemed her student had picked up a few tricks of his own after she'd set him loose, and had, in turn, passed them on to his own students. When the master-student cycle worked, this was what could be accomplished. She wasn't an adherent of the will of fire philosophy and related senju inspirational rubbish, she was too loyal an Uchiha for that, but some days she almost wanted to admit her clan's ancient rivals had a point. Aba sidled closer to his injured lover, and glanced at her knowingly. Mikoto could take a hint. She stood up straighter, and crossed her arms over her chest. Ishimaru needs his rest, she said, her tone making it an order. Why don't we all get going? I'm sure he'll be up for a visit tomorrow. The favor she'd come to his apartment to ask would have to wait. Even if he was emotionally steady enough to shore her up, his throat and lungs were too badly damaged for him to speak properly. Still, even though he'd barely said 5 intelligible words to her, for some reason she felt a little better. She'd screwed up royally with little Naruto, but as a mentor she'd come through for Ishimaru. Naruto wasn't even 7 yet. She had time to correct her past neglect. Everyone save Aba filed out, herself and Yojeo last. Has Haruka come by? Mikoto asked idly. Yojeo shook her head. I stopped by her apartment on the way here, but she's down south. Probably won't be back in the village for a few days. I left her a note. They walked to the elevators in companionable silence, and when they reached them Yojeo paused with her hand on the call button. Excuse me, sensei, she said, but I have a favor to ask you. Sasuke-kun has started school by now, hasn't he? Then I was wondering, would you be able to take over training Ishimaru's team for a while? The next round of Chunin exams are a little over a month away. I would pitch in myself, but my mission schedule might be getting very full very quickly, she said, absently rubbing a spot on her right deltoid. I'm sure the Hokage will recognize your abilities, Mikoto said warmly, keeping her reply equally ambiguous. Yojeo had expressed an interest in applying for Umbu the last time they'd spoken. She must have been invited to participate in the tryouts. Despite the unspoken prejudice against Kunoichi from the ranks as a whole, with her skills Mikoto didn't think a place on the elite squad was out of her reach. Like herself, Yojeo was a ninja that fought primarily with her head, instead of her fists, a master of traps and ambushes. In an UMBU operative serving during peacetime, subtlety and stealth were often more valuable than flashy ninjutsu, or the strength to crush rocks in your teeth. Before her marriage was arranged, her old teammate Daisuhiro had urged Mikoto to try out herself. If she'd gotten in, it would have made her one of the first female members in history, but that was one goal her future father-in-law had managed to shoot out of the sky. She wanted Yojeo to make it, and succeed where she had faltered. That boys' club needs a little shaking up, she added tartly. Thank you, her student said softly, with a small nod and a smile, and returned to the subject at hand. The other instructors will be adding the kids to teams as they see fit, so you wouldn't have to go with them on missions. This is strictly informal tutoring. Well, I would have the time, but I'm so far out of fighting trim it's not even funny. Would they even consent to being trained by a housewife? If someone gave that option to me as a genin, I would have thought it was a bad joke. A twinkle of amusement appeared in the younger woman's eyes. Considering how well you managed to beat their sensei into shape for his exams, I think they might if that housewife was you. True enough. I'll definitely think about it, and let you know no later than the end of the week. Her answer would have been an unequivocal yes, but she wasn't sure how Fugaku would take it. She'd really enjoyed teaching, and being presented with a no-strings-attached opportunity to return was perfect. But tutoring the three genin was skirting dangerously close to unretiring as a jonin, and there were few things her husband disliked more than being reminded his wife probably had the potential to become a better shinobi than he was. She pondered how best to approach the delicate topic for the rest of the day. Mikoto could charm her way into almost anyone's good graces, a talent that had served her well in her brief career as an infiltration specialist, and possibly even more so as wife of the chief of police. Despite her status, people let their guard down around her. The wives of his detectives confided things in her their husbands would never dream of telling Fugaku. She cultivated her plot of informants with frequent invitations to tea and charity luncheons, and it rarely failed her. She tapped her sources, assembled a plan of attack, and, after careful preparation, broached the subject at dinner. "Have you made any progress with your case?" she asked, over his favorite dish of hearty beef yakisoba. She already knew the answer to this question. Otherwise she wouldn't have asked. He was always testy if he felt like a case was stagnating, and sometimes took it out on her, if she was dumb enough to give him the opening. The secretaries at the headquarters were notorious gossips, occasionally irritating when she was the subject of their whispers, but such a valuable source of information about the state of village politics she always forgave them. "We have, finally," he said, sounding immensely pleased with himself. The Kiri spy was stubborn as they come, and somehow warded against the more basic mind probes, but Inoichi-san cracked the seal this morning. "We should have a list of his contacts by tomorrow." Sasuke slurped noisily at this noodles. Itachi, as was becoming more frequently the case, was absent. "That's really cool," he said. "Some of those Kiri ninja are creepy. They do this weird thing to their teeth to make themselves look like sharks. Or maybe they're born like that, which is, well, that's even creepier. I'm glad you got him. When I think about one running around our village messing stuff up." He trailed off and shuddered. "When I graduate, can I help you with cases like that?" "Of course you can," his father replied, helping himself to more noodles, and not really listening. Sasuke's shoulders slumped noticeably. Mikoto was dignified enough not to roll her eyes at the table, but she really wished her husband would stop doing that. In private he spoke rather highly of Sasuke's abilities when the subject came up, and she knew he loved him on some level, but it wouldn't hurt to let the boy know now and again. And Sasuke was starting to be able to tell when he was being humored. Eventually, he was going to work up the nerve to say something like, "When I graduate, can I run off to join a secret organization of S-class rogue ninja with some insane plan to take over the world," and Fugaku was going to give him full permission. Not that he'd ever take his father up on it, but still. "That's such a relief," Mikoto gushed. "You've been working so hard lately, I feel like I hardly ever see you. With the boys gone all day too, it's a little lonely." He shook his head. "It was a good break, but this is only the beginning. We still don't know how extensive their network is. I don't expect things to settle down for another month at the very least." "A month of you out of my hair? Perfect," she thought. "Oh, she said sadly, externally the picture of the dutiful wife. I see. He put down his chopsticks, looking as apologetic as he ever got. You don't have to stay home all day. Let Iriko-chan help you with the cleaning, we can certainly afford it. Go out and enjoy yourself, now that Sasuke is in school. I don't know what I would. She began, as if her entire world was confined to dustpans and laundry baskets, then smiled as if a wonderful idea had occurred to her. I know. One of my genin team, Ishimaru, remember him, was badly injured on a mission, and is going to be stuck in the hospital for weeks. The timing was just awful, with the Chunin exams coming up, and he couldn't find anyone to tutor his team while he's recuperating. I'm so out of practice, but better than nothing, and they're such talented kids it would be a shame for them to have to wait another 6 months to enter. That's an idea, I suppose, Fugaku said, not entirely pleased but not openly opposed, either. Mikoto could work with that. She was just doing a favor for a bedridden friend, out of the goodness of her heart. That it meant pulling her shinobi gear out of the closet was incidental. She picked daintily at her noodles, as if patching together a plan in her head. I can work with them while Sasuke is in school, so I'll be home in time to meet him, and get dinner on the table. This is going to be the first joint exam since the war broke out, isn't it? He said contemplatively. Konoha will need a stronger showing than usual. Oh, that's right, she said. I'm not 100% sure, but I heard it's in Iwa this time. Iwa. He sneered. A large chunk of the police force had been mobilized near the end of the war, including Fugaku, and he held on to his grudges like a starving wolf. Iwa and Konoha were now officially at peace, but the war was recent enough there was still plenty of bad blood. More than a few of the Konoha genin would be looking for vengeance in the stadium, and the opposite would be true as well. It was expected to be a particularly deadly exam. We need all the strong genin we can get. Go ahead. See what you can do with them. Mikoto thanked him and went back to her bowl. Hook, line, and sinker, she thought between delicate bites. Chapter 3. Mikoto returned to visit Ishimaru once more that week, and happily reported to him that his genin wouldn't be teacherless for long. He'd taken to communicating with a pad of paper and a stubby pencil while the heat damage to his lungs healed, and wrote in very large characters, I almost feel sorry for the little brats, underlining it twice, after she related the good news. He was no doubt remembering his first training session, after his team committed to the exams for their second time. Haruka and Yojeo just about had to carry him home. A few days later, Sasuke found himself shooed out of the door, and a rice ball shoved in his mouth, at 7:15 in the morning, even though the school was only 15 minutes away. Luckily, he was a naturally early riser, and too bewildered to protest the disruption in routine. Besides, it gave him more time to sweep for Naruto's traps before the first bell rang. Her temporary team were to meet her at Training Ground 3 at 8 sharp, and Mikoto needed time to prepare. Their first session together was primarily so she could feel out their strengths and weaknesses, and tailor her lessons accordingly. That, and make sure they knew very well how dangerous this delicate flower of the home could be if she so chose. Yojeo might have warned them how strict she could be, and they might behave, but she had the feeling she was going to have to put her foot down very hard on some genin toes this morning. She would have preferred the opportunity to build up a bit of camaraderie before putting them through the ringer, but there wasn't time. She was more than a little apprehensive about the home team competition. The hosting village always fielded far more candidates than the visitors. The kids were going to need some toughening up before they were ready to go up against young Iwa Ninja with their parents' scores to settle. To make it even worse, the exams were undeniably stacked against medical specialists. Such teams often split up for the purposes of the test, attaching themselves to incomplete combat-focused groups who'd had a member promoted. Team 2 had already decided they'd be testing together. Yes, they were going to need her help, and they weren't going to like it. In the long run, it didn't matter if they thought she was as sadistic as some of the career torturers in Umbuti and I as long as they didn't come back from Iwagakure in body bags. Mikoto edged into the bedroom closet, and pulled out a battered, very heavy box from the bottom of a stack. She sneezed once at the dust she disturbed, and opened it. One by one she laid the contents out on her bed, and began to undress. She picked up the male shirt, considered the weight and the ambient temperature, and pulled it on. She didn't expect her young charges to be very accurate with their projectiles, but a beginner's wild throws could be dangerous primarily because they were so unpredictable. She shook out the high-collared gray shirt, frowning at the loose threads attaching the Uchiha emblem to the right sleeve. She'd meant to mend that, really. 6 years ago. The patch she pulled off completely, and tossed back in the box so it wouldn't come loose and get lost. The black leggings still fit, if she did a funny thing with her abdominal muscles, and didn't breath in too hard. Her hair she twirled up in a bun, and secured with a square of cloth tightened by a cord to keep it out of her face. Finally, she shrugged on her collarless flak jacket, and buckled on the pouches for her throwing weapons. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror. The gentle wife and mother had disappeared, and a severe-looking kunoichi had taken her place. With her hair pulled back, and the familiar weight of her shuriken on her hip, she felt herself standing straighter, unwilling to cast her eyes down as a proper Uchiha woman should. She buckled on her high open-toed boots and long gloves, and left through the window instead of the door, although she doubted she'd be recognized dressed as she was. She took the roofs, and then the trees, to the training field, purposely arriving early to give herself time to catch her breath. Her new students could never be allowed to see how out of shape she was, it was beyond embarrassing. Her younger self could have kept such a pace going for hours, but after the births of 2 children her dedication to her old training routine had lapsed, to understate things. Although, there was no particular reason she couldn't take it up again, as long as she started slowly. She had the time, and, as she discovered after a brief moment of consideration, the will. After an absence of years, Mikoto felt that old yearning to be able to prove herself on the field, to test her limits against another's, and find herself victorious. The first of her students arrived in the clearing before she could ponder too closely who she wanted to prove herself to. It was Hyuga Kaito first, followed a few seconds later by the other 2, Inyazuka Hana, plus 3 quarreling puppies, and Aburame Shimazen taking up the rear. She'd stopped by the records office yesterday, and requested their personnel files and a couple of C-rank mission reports to skim over. On paper they seemed like a very promising team. Kaito was the surgeon and rising star. Hyuga medics were highly sought after in the medical corps, since one of them was practically a walking surgical theater all by themselves. They could diagnose fractures or internal injuries with complete precision under the most rugged field conditions, and perform bloodless, delicate surgery without the need for the scopes and incisions other physicians relied upon. The other 2 weren't prodigies, but far from a burden. Hana was training as a veterinarian, which was going to win her a lot of friends among all the Ninken contracted with Konoha Shinobi, and her own companions would be invaluable on missions that required tracking down an incapacitated ally whose exact location was unknown. Shimazen was just as intriguing. Even she had heard of the techniques pioneered by his world-renowned mother, a woman who possessed a very unusual colony of Kikaicha specializing in the analysis and production of various chemicals. If he was anywhere near as proficient in his use of the insects, it would allow him to manufacture a wide array of drugs almost at will. "Mikoto-sensei," Kaito said, putting a sneer into the honorific. "Good morning." "Good morning," the other 2 chorused, slightly more politely. They followed his lead willingly, it seemed. If she asserted her authority over him, the other 2 would probably fall into line. His blank white eyes were defiant, scanning probable strength and skill even without his Byakugan active. He did not look impressed with what he found. That was fine with her. If he wanted to be so foolish as to judge her abilities based on her looks, he was welcome. She'd have that beaten out of him soon enough. It wasn't a conceit a Chunin could afford. His contempt would be almost funny, if she wasn't aware of the extenuating circumstances. She didn't know him well yet, but she guessed that most of his current swagger was feigned. He had looked much more like a frightened child when she saw him hovering near his sensei's hospital bed last week. He seemed unusually attached to Ishimaru given his status in the clan. His home life was probably ugly right now. The business with the attempted kidnapping of Hyuga Hinata by Kumo had recently been resolved, but at the cost of a branch house member's life. It must have been a severe blow to learn how little your own clan valued the life of one member over another, when they were separated only by an accident of birth. The boy was currently acting very Unchunin-like, but she still wanted him to pass. According to Ishimaru, he was the most promising young medic the Corps had seen in decades, and he could do a tremendous amount of good once he was able to operate on his own. In Ishimaru's absence, it would be her job to ensure he didn't get his skinny neck broken in the exams before his talents could come to fruition. The other two, her student had confided, needed more polish on their tactics before they were really contenders for a promotion, but participating would be a good experience for them, provided they were proficient enough to survive it. "Good morning, ducklings," she replied cheerfully. "Do you mind if I call you ducklings?" "Yes," Kaito stonily, looking at her like she was insane. The other two exchanged glances confirming their young leader's unspoken assessment. "I thought we could start off with a little exercise to see how far along your offensive skills are," she said, continuing like she hadn't even heard his objection, and rooted around in a vest pocket for 3 scraps of paper. "On these are 3 tracking seals, the children to the parent seal I have on my palm." She held her left hand up and sent a brief pulse of chakra through it, to illuminate the design through the fabric of her gloves. To activate them, prick a finger, and dab it in the center. The seal will transfer from the paper to your bodies. The objective is for at least one of you to get close enough to touch my bare skin with that finger for the full 5 seconds it takes to transfer the child seal back to its parent. You have until 2 o'clock. I have to be home before my son gets back from school. Are you ready? They all nodded. By the way, this is a live weapons exercise. If you don't come at me with the intent to kill, you'll lose, and next time I see Ishimaru I'll have to tell him you were beaten by some housewife who hasn't been on a real mission in a decade. Begin. You're wearing gloves, Shimazen pointed out unnecessarily. How are we supposed to? At her unspoken signal, one of Hana's puppies took the initiative, and lunged at her ankle. There was a small puff of smoke in a shower of branches, and it fell on its rump with a stick in its teeth. Mikoto resisted the urge to coo from her perch in the trees above their heads. Ninken just hated that. She targeted Kaito with her first genjutsu, right as he, predictably, activated his Byakugan, bathing his panoramic vision in light so intense he could be staring into the sun from every direction. He could theoretically see through the illusion, but instinct took over before he could make the effort. He screamed, clapped his hands over his face, and deactivated the Dojutsu. As an afterthought, she tossed out an area illusion of the overpowering scent of cheap perfume to take care of Hana and her dogs. The clearing soon echoed with a chorus of puppy sneezes and vivid cursing. A quick glance confirmed Shimazen was too preoccupied with his fallen leader to go after her. That was disappointing. A lack of initiative robbed their team of a good opportunity. A Kakaicha colony's collective mind was too alien for her genjutsu to affect it, so he was the best equipped to go after an illusionist like herself. She took advantage of their preoccupation to disappear into the trees. 3 rookie genin versus 1 very out-of-shape jonin. The game was on. It was another 4 hours before she let them actually see her again, having lead them on an erratic and frustrating chase through the forested training ground. Whenever their leader tried to pinpoint her location with his Byakugan, she'd blind him again. After a couple more tries, he gave up. She got more creative with Hana, throwing out, in succession, the smell of barbecue, kerosene, pine resin, and decomposing fish. Shimazen ought to have tagged her with a Kikai already, and short of stripping naked she'd probably never be able to pick it off, but he was letting the other two lead the way. If he didn't build up confidence in his tracking abilities, he was never going to get anywhere. She dusted off half a dozen of her old tricks during the leisurely pursuit, nothing worse than what she'd originally done to Kaito, but damned annoying all the same. There was the classic covered in bugs illusion, which had Hana ready to strangle an offended Shimazen before Kaito intervened, an area illusion that moved the stream running through the grounds a step to the north and drenched them all in freezing water, and another that transformed a massive berry bramble into what looked like a lovely clearing to stop and have a ration bar. While it was true genjutsu could do no physical harm, the goal of the art was to make opponents so frightened, angry, or disoriented they committed a fatal error, or to immobilize them so they could be captured alive. A spray of ice could seem to lock their limbs in place. The lip of a cliff could appear to extend a step past its true end. An array of exploding tags could be completely concealed in bare ground. Despite her relative restraint, by the time they did finally catch a glimpse of her, all 3 genin were ready to chew bricks. If they had begun this exercise with any reservations about punching a housewife in the face, they'd melted away by now. Having fun, kids? She asked, with more of that sadistic cheer, after finally letting Hana pick up her trail and corner her against the cliff face. All of them glared. She could feel it even behind Shimazen's sunglasses. There was a point to this torment. Their teamwork looked good on the surface, but she wanted to see if they held together under pressure, without Ishimaru there to fill in the cracks. The Chunin exams always included some kind of mission simulation, and it was absolutely imperative the three of them stick together for the duration of that stage. They were going to be hungry, sleep-deprived, possibly injured, and heartily sick of each other's company, but under no circumstances could they allow their teamwork to falter. Unlike some teams, which included a heavy hitter who could dispatch multiple opponents solo, these three would have to work together very closely to keep from being picked off by teams with more firepower. They had performed adequately in that regard, at least, and thanks to their clans' respective skills were nearly impossible to ambush. But she was very worried that none of them seemed to be formulating a strategy for taking her down. They would have to plan very carefully, bluff their little heads off, cut deals, and in general be far more devious than they'd acted so far in order to clear the survival stage. They didn't seem to be getting anywhere, and she needed to see how they fought. Maybe it was time to give them a shove. She targeted Shimazen first, guessing from his reticence that he was the least skilled short-range fighter. Kaito sensed her intent, and leaped between her and her intended target, sliding into a Jyoken stance as Shimazen scrambled hastily out of the way. The smaller boy was perfectly ready to defend himself, too, and looked more surprised than herself at Kaito's interference. Mikoto slid around his blows without much effort, using her Sharingan to memorize his sloppy forms for later critique. Even she could tell he'd sacrificed quite a few hours in the practice ring for more time in the library. By Hyuga standards, he must be an embarrassment. The way he leapt in to cover his friend was one half sweet and one half pathetic. She played with him for a few more moments, taking mental notes, before removing him from the fight with a stunning blow just below his sternum. She tossed him aside, coughing and gasping but not seriously hurt. Hana let out a cry of distress, and charged her. She was a fairly tall, sturdy girl, the cord muscle in her bare arms testament to her more balanced approach to physical and mental training. She was surprisingly fast, and facile with the controlled chaos of the Inyazuka style of taijutsu. They went back and forth for a while, her opinion of the girl's physical skills rising. Only Mikoto's crimson eyes warned her of a sudden gathering of energy in Hana's fingers before a chakra scalpel buzzed into existence, extending her reach by half a very, very sharp hand. Without her Sharingan, Hana might even have been able to score a hit, if she was lucky and Mikoto was not. With the Sharingan, it was not a contest. Mikoto twisted away from the bluish chakra blade, and caught the girl's wrist in an agonizing hold that shattered her concentration. The deadly glow faded. It had been a decent effort, and a second or two in the right place was more than enough time to sever a tendon or major artery. The chakra scalpel required such sustained concentration it was difficult to use in a melee, but, employed by a skilled and experienced medic, it gave a tremendous advantage in unarmed combat. The man who took over the medical corps after Tsunade-sama left the village was reputed to be unrivaled in its use. Mikoto disappeared in an illusory swirl of leaves, to give the genin time to nurse their bruises, while she got her breath back from farther down the cliff wall. She dispatched a shadow clone to watch them, while she found a nice, sun-warmed rock to have some water and a few handful of trail mix. She was dusting the salt from her hands when the clone's memories flooded in. It made her dizzy for a moment. Shadow clones were extremely useful, and she had the chakra reserves to create 24 before tiring herself out. But even when she was still on active duty, she'd never gotten any more comfortable with that sensation. Eyes closed but ears open, she sifted through the memories attempting to settle themselves in her brain. It looked like the earlier, illusory bugs in the bra incident she'd orchestrated between Hana and Shimazen reopened an old wound, and, despite Kaito's diplomatic efforts, the Aburame had stalked off in a huff. It was the stupidest thing he could possibly have done, too stupid for a genin with as much field experience as Shimazen had. She had yet to meet the Aburame that didn't value both logical actions and group cohesion above nearly all else, and the tantrum went violently against character for one of them. He was probably setting himself out on a bait hook so the others could ambush her. She'd take it. It wasn't as though she had anything else to do, and they needed to be taught that such a transparent ploy wasn't going to make the cut for a Chunin. She didn't bother masking her presence with an illusion. If he was smart, he'd tagged her before the exercise even began, and his scouts would be able to locate her even if their host couldn't. He was muttering inconsiderate, and probably untrue, things about Hana as he walked, hands in the pockets of his long coat, and pretending he didn't know she was there. 5 chakra signatures were creeping up ever so stealthily from behind her. They were masked passably well, and another genin wouldn't have been able to sense them, even the dogs, which was impressive. She listened for a few moments, debating what to do with him, when she heard, "Not fair. No way Sensei's sensei could be this much of a cun." Now that was too much. Her hands flowed through the signs for the Shunshin Jutsu, and suddenly she was behind him. It wasn't the best one she'd ever pulled off. She infused the technique with far too much chakra, and her vision went black for a split second. She covered her stumble by bringing her hands down hard on his bony shoulders. "Care to repeat that?" she said sweetly into his ear. He shrieked, and his surprise, at least, was not feigned. A small swarm of insects boiled out of his sleeves, but they didn't attack her. Aside from a few nips, they barely siphoned off anything from her large chakra reserves. All they were doing was zipping about in a panic. Shimazan seemed to be having trouble controlling them. She wondered absently whether it was the Aburame equivalent of wetting one's pants in fright. He was so preoccupied with his disobedient allies, he didn't even have the presence of mind to attempt to grab her, even though she held no weapons. Disappointing. She released him, and vaulted away as a snarling Hana dropped from the trees into the space she had recently occupied, right into the cloud of beetles. She started to cough violently, and was replaced by a puff of smoke and a choking puppy with a mouth full of bugs. Another 2 rushed her from either side, cracking twigs as they went, in an attempt to pin her where she'd landed. They was substantial, that would be more of her Jujin Bunshin, then. Mikoto executed a second, and more elegant, Shunshin. The 2 Hanas collided with simultaneous pained yips as the last attacked in tandem with Kaito, who had finally revealed himself, trying to overwhelm her with wild blows, while the Hyuga snuck in a single disabling hit. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Shimazan scuttle off into the bushes. She knocked them both on their backsides, and leapt to a narrow ledge on the cliff, then clear over their heads and back into the tree cover, where Shimazan had retreated. He had hidden himself from her eyes, but her sensory abilities were too sharp for his chakra to likewise disappear. Was he planning something, or was he running scared? Her eyes caught another Shimazan in front of her, imperfectly hidden in a tree slightly to her left. The chakra she could see was a heaving, buzzing mass of very weak signatures. He didn't even know better than to use a Kikai Bunshin against a Shari-non. The tactics definitely needed work. Her hands formed the single sign she required for a weak, but long-ranged, and very accurate, Katon. She drew in a sharp breath, and spat the spear of flame at the clone, which exploded into its constituent bugs at the last instant. The ones at the center were too slow to avoid it, and burned to ashes. The real Shimazan jumped away in a rustle of leaves, his weak ruse destroyed. She followed him into the tree branches, and drew out some shuriken, aiming to frighten him rather than cause any real injuries. He dodged all but one, which clipped him in the calf. His control broke just as his foot made contact with the bark, and with the anchoring chakra disrupted, he slipped forward and smacked his face into a low branch before he could catch himself. He grunted in pain, and fell to the forest floor, blood streaming from his nose, and the cuts around his eyes where the frame of his glasses had broken. That she hadn't intended, but she couldn't very well rush to his side and start fussing over it, even if the motherly side of her wanted to. He was a medic. If he'd injured himself in the barely controlled fall, he could perform his own first aid, and on the field he'd have to do so whether or not he was in pain. She withdrew to plan her next action, leaning against the mossy trunk of a downed tree. The genin had wasted more than 4.5 hours chasing her with nothing to show for it. None of them had managed to touch her for even a full second, never mind 5. She was beginning to doubt Ishimaru's assurances that his team was ready for this exam. He'd always been a soft touch, and in a shinobi this was not a desirable personality trait. If he hadn't turned out to be such a skilled healer, which mostly kept him out of combat situations, he would have washed out long ago. Had his team pestered him into allowing them to compete together? Had he done so against his better judgment, to be nice? Mikoto scowled into the trees. She expected better from a jonin she herself had trained. Unlike some, she did believe there was a place for kindness in a shinobi's life, but if it increased the chances your teammates would be injured or killed, it was in the wrong place. She levered herself up from her seat, and then fell back with an undignified half-stumble when a wave of dizziness crashed over her. Mikoto shook her head to clear it. That was odd. She shouldn't have this much trouble catching her breath, either. Her heart was still hammering like she'd just finished a lap around the village walls, and her meager lunch was churning in her stomach. She gave herself a few minutes of rest before moving again, but the tightness in her chest didn't go away. It felt, if anything, even worse. She got to her feet again, despite the uncomfortable sensation, and staggered when the forest around her began spinning alarmingly. Definitely poisoned, she thought, as the ground pitched and tossed her to her hands and knees. Several things began to make sense all at once, and, despite how ill she was starting to feel, she smiled. She hadn't even noticed Shimazen plant the envenomed Kikaicho, and she really had walked right into their ambush within an ambush. It didn't mention in his dossier that his specialized colony could manufacture poisons, only medicines, but even drugs one purchased off the shelf at the pharmacy could be dangerous in large doses, or if mixed with other, incompatible chemicals. They hadn't been trying very hard to disable her in combat, because they had been planning on doing so using their medical knowledge, and there was no sense in wasting strength they had to conserve very carefully. She wouldn't be surprised to discover at least some of Kaito and Shimazen's incompetence in taijutsu was an act, intended to lull her into overconfidence. Using the limited resources at their disposal, they had concocted and executed a rather clever plan. Turned one of her favorite weapons against her, in fact. Poison could be time-consuming to prepare, and dangerous for the clumsy, but for someone as physically weak as she was, it was one of the best ways to even out a fight. And it worked hand-in-hand with her genjutsu. Even something as innocuous as a few cups of sake significantly increased susceptibility to illusion, and she knew how to concoct hallucinogens so powerful even another Uchiha would no longer be able to distinguish fantasy from reality. Whatever Shimazen had whipped up wasn't quite to that caliber, but it had frayed her powers of perception considerably. Slumped over in the moss, she barely even sensed it before one of Hana's dogs strolled out from the underbrush. Not feeling so good, huh? It said smugly, in a squeaky voice. Kaito Onisan told me to tell you that you're going to start experiencing, what was it again? It paused to worry its jaw with a hind leg in a charming canine approximation of a head scratch. Oh right, tachycardia, convulsions, and death, unless you let us give you the antidote in under an hour. We're all hanging out by the training dummy with no head, but you probably knew that already. Bye. It bounded off into the ground cover, without waiting for an answer. Make her come to them in the state she was in, she couldn't say she didn't deserve it. She pulled herself to her feet, and began weaving her way towards her soon-to-be victorious team. She was almost certain they were bluffing about the convulsions and death part, but not certain enough to bet her life on it. Drug overdoses could turn very ugly, very fast, and she'd already gotten what she wanted from this startlingly crafty batch of genin. When she staggered to the clearing holding the battered dummies, she found Kaito sitting cross-legged on the grass across from Shimazen, one hand glowing gently green as he tended to the other boy's broken nose. The front of his coat was covered in blood, but he no longer seemed to be in pain. I surrender, she panted, half collapsing against the trunk of a convenient tree. Intent on his work, Kaito didn't even turn to look at her. Hana, he ordered. She rose from her place on a stump, and approached Mikoto, drawing a kunai just in case. Hana pushed up Mikoto's sleeve, and pressed 2 fingers against her bare arm, until the seal unlaced itself and flowed back to its parent. Kaito scrubbed his fingers clean on the grass, and finally looked at her. There is no antidote, if you're wondering, he said, not sounding nearly as pleased with himself as she felt he had the right to be. The shortness of breath and nausea will go away by themselves in an hour or two. May we go? Not yet, she said. Sit down. She didn't feel too bad, as long as she remembered to breathe at a reasonable pace, and kept her head steady. Hana sat, without any back talk. Shimazen rotated to look her, squinting without his glasses. All of you good work, she said. Ishimaru told me you were a talented team. I had my doubts, but you've proven him right. The others looked confused, and Kaito insulted. You spent the entire time playing with us. If this had been a real mission, you could have killed us 100 times over. All we did was get in each other's way, and trip over our own feet. He looked away, his jaw clenched. Well, this wasn't a real mission, and teaching you how not to trip over your own feet is why I'm here. I'll see you tomorrow at 8, she said. We'll be beginning weight training. Wear your chainmail if you have it. Thank you for your time, Mikoto-sensei, Kaito said stiffly, rising to his feet, but that won't be necessary. I will not be entering the exams this year. Or any year. Hana, Shimazen, my apologies. He shouldered his bag and began to walk away. There was a moment of dumbfounded silence. What? Hana burst out, whipping around. Are you nuts? You can't quit. Can't we talk about? Kaito didn't turn around. I have to go. Hyuga-sama is expecting me. You're not thinking rationally, Shimazen said, rising quietly, and taking a few steps after him. Without you our team is incomplete. You can replace me, Kaito said over his shoulder. No, Shimazen answered. I don't think we can. Kaito ignored him and resumed walking. Kaito-kun, Mikoto said. Come here and sit down. That's an order. For a moment she was afraid he wasn't going to stop, and she wasn't in any condition to chase after him if he didn't want to be caught. Thankfully, he did turn, and tossed his bag back at her feet, albeit reluctantly. I'll see you two tomorrow, she said, another order. Hana looked like she wanted to say something, but bit her lip and held it back. Shimazen collected her things, and silently held them out to her. The two genin began the walk back to the village in glum silence. Mikoto cursed inwardly. What a mess. This had been simmering since the disastrous mission to the Kusa border, if not even longer. If she'd had any idea Kaito's resolve had deteriorated this much, she never would have pressed them the way she had. Ninja made a career out of being hard to read, but the Hyuga boy had taken this to new heights. Ishimaru probably wasn't even fully aware how close to the breaking point his prize student had been. His real teacher should have been the one to set Kaito back on course, but Ishimaru wasn't here. That was part of the problem. Thanks to her own efforts, Kaito feared and disliked, if not outright hated, his new substitute teacher, and any support she offered would be looked at with suspicion. What a mess. Hana-kun is right. You can't quit, Mikoto said. Why do you even care? He asked, scowling at a clod of dirt next to her boot. You think we're nothing but pests. Because you are my student's student. And despite my first impression, I don't. The exercise was a psychological test as much as a physical one. I wanted to see if your team would splinter under pressure, the same kind of pressure you'll be facing in the exams. I don't torment my students for my own amusement. Under most circumstances, she much preferred being the understanding, big sisterly jonin instructor archetype than the callous bitch, but Kaito didn't know that, and he looked skeptical. A test. All of you passed. Kaito snorted. I passed, he said. I find that hard to believe. Why? She asked. You kept your team working together under stress, and formulated a successful plan to eliminate a much stronger and more experienced opponent. What makes you so convinced you're not fit to be a chunin? You were the one sparring with me. That didn't make it obvious. No. It didn't. She crossed her arms over her chest. Explain it to me. Kaito drew his knees up under his chin. I'm a complete failure. Everyone in the clan thinks so. Not at being a doctor, maybe. But at being a ninja. He snorted again. The only reason I even graduated on time was because of these. He split his fingers into a V, and pointed to his pale, unearthly eyes. I can see Tenketsu as well as anyone else, but I'm so slow and clumsy it doesn't matter. My taijutsu is so far behind the other kids in the clan, I just can't. I mean, my cousin Neji-kun can knock me on the floor, and he's 8. I'd be dead weight on a real mission. I'd hold my team back, maybe even get them. What happened to Ishimaru is not your fault, she said firmly, cutting him off. You weren't there. It was. I fell for the trap and I was the one Ishimaru-sensei jumped in to protect. Shimazen and Hana would have gotten out on their own, and out of range. I can't be responsible for something like that ever again. If I stay in Konoha, I can work at the hospital, and still help the people that need it. I wouldn't be putting anyone else at risk. His hands tightened around the fabric of his pants, and he looked down at the ground, trying to blink away tears. She pretended not to notice. Team 2 was closer than most, and it was painfully obvious how much the boy cared about his teacher and his teammates. But that attachment had twisted in on itself, leaving him poisoned with guilt if they came to any kind of harm. Every shinobi had to come to terms with that guilt, quit the life they'd chosen, or go mad. She felt for him her own crossroads had been Hatake Asekumo. For months after her teacher's suicide, she racked her brain for some word or gesture that could have lifted his suffocating depression, some tiny thing she had failed to do that would have made the difference. Time was a salve for that failure, and now she knew had done everything she could. It just hadn't been enough. The only option was to keep living her life, and cherish the gifts he'd left behind. Asekumo had been a deeply compassionate man, and the finest of teachers. She could only hope she was following in his footsteps. "You're afraid?" she asked, letting some gentleness into her tone, so he didn't think it was an accusation. "Yes," he admitted, almost petulant. "I'm afraid. I told you I wasn't much of a ninja." "Whoever told you ninja are never afraid?" she said. "Your fear is a tool. It keeps you from being overly reckless, but you cannot let it control you. Even great ninjas still feel fear. Even the Hokage. The difference between them and you isn't that they're faster or stronger. It's that at this moment you've decided to surrender to your fear, because it's the easy way out. And that is what myself and your teammates and Ishimaru, if he were here, would find unacceptable." When he said nothing, she continued. "You're a Hyuga. You were born with a gift, and it's your duty to put that gift to the best use you possibly can. You're a brilliant field medic, you'd be wasted in the hospital, and you know it. And yes, as a field medic you will sometimes be required to defend yourself. But that's just it," he said. "How can I? I've tried and tried, and my Jyoken never gets any better. So what if your Jyoken is terrible?" she said, and he flinched from the raw truth. "Have you ever tried long-range weapons? Elemental ninjutsu? Looked into a summoning contract?" From the blank look he gave her, she assumed that was a no. The Hyuga were fiercely proud of their eyes, possibly even more so than her own clan, and that pride had, ironically, blinded them to the needs of the young man sitting in front of her. "I might have been able to beat you hand to hand," she continued, "but when I was younger, for an Uchiha, my taijutsu was awful. I was too weak, too small, and had no endurance. So I concentrated on what I could do, genjutsu, and made myself one of the best. The way I fought was unorthodox, but it worked, and I succeeded in my missions. The Hyuga elders might not like it at first, but if you have to abandon Jyoken, and find some other way to complete your missions, so be it. It might be hard, but they should come around eventually, if you can prove you're a skilled shinobi." "But what if they don't?" he asked quietly. She took a deep breath. "Then that's their failing, not yours. If your family doesn't understand, I'm not saying it won't hurt, but you'll still have the respect of your team, and the rest of the medical corps, not to mention all of the Konoha shinobi whose lives you'll be able to save. They're more important than the elders' pride. Much more." Kaito uncurled himself, and looked up at the sun hanging just above the treetops. "I really do have to go," he said, no longer petulant, but contemplative. "I want to try to catch up with Hana and Shimazen on the way home." She nodded. "Tomorrow at 8? she asked. He hesitated for a moment as he picked up his bag. "Yes," he said. "I'll be there." That's it for part 1. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.